Okay guys, this is the second video. This is a guide to the exam for Unit 2 AS Level Government and Politics. Okay, so unlike Section A and unlike Section C, Section B actually has two possible question types. We call them compare or connect. So in other words, you are being asked to compare political issues or connect them in some way. We'll walk through this quite slowly. So something to bear in mind is the importance of timing. Like all questions in this exam, you've got to allow yourself appropriate time for each question. This question is worth 24 marks, and to put that into perspective, Section C is worth 44. So it's important that you don't go over time with this question too much, even if you're quite confident in it, because you'll sell yourself short of time for Section C. So around 24, 25 minutes maximum is what you should be spending on this question. As I've said, there's two types of questions for this, compare or comparison, or making connections between political issues. So let's have a little look at how these fall. So the first one is the connections question. Now, in the last year or two, many of these have come up. It's not guaranteed. They could ask you either a connection or compare question, so you have to be ready for either of them. So let's have a little look at this example from the summer of 2024. The question is, using extract A, as well as your own knowledge, explain how referendums impact participation in a democracy. So straight away, you should be able to notice that that is a connections question. Why? Because the examiner is asking you to make a link between referendums, like Brexit, like on Welsh independence. How did those referendums impact people participating into democracy? Okay. Now, what is different about this question from section A and C is this is the only one that will give you some source material. In this case, you have a breakdown of referenda since 1997 to around 2016 across the UK. And what's important about the extract is the examiner is giving you the extract to help you a little bit, okay? But I'm an examiner for this paper, and I've seen lots of students just use the extract, okay? You've got to bring in your own knowledge outside of the extract, and we'll walk through that now in a second. But let's focus on the extract first, because let's try and spot. Already, the examiner is going to expect you to start to see some connections. How do referenda affect political participation? Well, straight away, you might notice some of these referenda have very high turnouts. The Belfast Agreement in Northern Ireland in 1998, 81%. That's a high turnout. Scottish independence in 2014, nearly 85%. And Brexit in 2016, 72%. So straight away, you've got one connection that's made there. Okay, holding a referenda can lead to high political turnout and high participation. So already you've got one section of your essay there using some of the information from the extract. What is also interesting is that's not always the case. If you look particularly at the UK voting system referendum in 2011, under 50%, 42% of people turned out to that. So straight away, you've made another connection there. Actually, if the issue of the referendum, like electoral systems, is perhaps confusing or not as glamorous as some of the others, then voter turnout actually is quite low. Very, very similar. Welsh devolution in 1997, quite surprisingly, was around 50%, with 50% of people in Wales not taking part in that referenda. So the extract is there to help you, and you must refer to it every now and again. And I've managed to make two connections there, maybe three, based on the extract that gets us thinking about our essay. However, you do need to bring your own knowledge in. So let's have a look how we're going to do that. So, if you were to think about how referenda impact political participation, there's a couple of areas you might want to think of. One of them, in the top left, makes politics more understandable. Now, I put a question mark next to that because you could make a connection and say that with people being more engaged and with them sometimes being simple yes or no answers, that arguably politics can be made simpler for ordinary people. However, you could also argue something different and say, actually, electoral form and the intricacies of devolution and even the Brexit question. Did the people in the UK really understand the intricacies of our relationship with the European Union? Possibly not. Something undoubtable is the fact that it can be polarizing. In other words, these debates, because of their binary nature of yes or no, in or out, leave or remain, it often does create a tension amongst political participants and polarizes people's opinions. Undoubtedly, There's often an increase in media interest. I mean, Brexit is a key example of that. Okay, there were debates, there were daily news shows. It was everywhere for a few years, and there was a big talking point. And also, you could argue that these referenda sometimes increase short-term engagement. So people will become interested in politics because of a referendum. In Wales, for example, if there was a referendum in the near future on Welsh independence, people who feel strongly about Welsh identity might find themselves becoming more politically activated because of that referenda. Also, you could argue that sometimes when people get engaged in politics through a referendum, they then remain more politically active. There's many people, especially younger people, that became politically active because of Brexit and have probably remained politically participant ever since. So already here, from your own knowledge, you have a couple of examples of how you could set out this essay. The good news is that there's a really straightforward way of approaching this type of question. There's no introduction and no conclusion. I repeat that again, no introduction, no conclusion. You don't need to outline the debate. There's no debate here. You are simply making connections between referendum and participation in politics. So, this is roughly how you could break this down. This is an example of what I think is a good connections section where the candidate is making a clear connection whilst adding good examples and own knowledge. One way referendums impact political participation is by sparking a greater sense of political engagement. So clearly there, they've made a link between referenda and political engagement. Issues that directly affect people's daily lives tend to encourage high turnout. So that's a very clear connection there between the two. Now, this is where a useful example is used. For example, the 2016 Brexit referendum in the UK saw a high voter turnout of 72%, as it involves the UK's future relationship with the European Union. This can clearly be seen in the extract. There's also a subtle nod to the extract there, which I thought was quite clever. The importance of the issue encouraged people from all sides of the debate to participate, as they felt personally invested in the outcome. This is in contrast to general elections where voters may feel less connected to the specific policies of each party. So, hopefully, you can see there in one of those sections how this candidate is making a clear connection and bringing in some own knowledge and some examples to bolster that point. Another example. Referendums also tend to generate more polarized debates, which can either motivate people to vote or deter them. So, again, there's a clear link made there between referendum and participation. In highly divisive referendums, such as the 2014 Scottish independent referendum, where the issue of whether Scotland should remain part of the UK was at stake, people on both sides of the debate felt strongly about the outcome. This can increase participation as individuals feel their vote is crucial to the result. One thing I'll criticise this small extract here is from a sample answer is I think they could make reference to the extract there. Because if you remember, Scottish independence was referenced in the extract. So they could make an additional comment there and refer to the extract. And if we go back a little bit, you can see clearly there 60% turnout. So I actually think there was a missed opportunity there for the candidate to put that extract evidence in. However, divisive referendums can also lead to voter apathy if people believe their vote will not change the result, or if they feel the issue is too complex to address in a single vote. So there's a clear connection there made between the two factors. So this is roughly what your essay could look like, making connections between referendum 3 times in terms of participation, the media, or polarization. I would say 3 is probably a minimum and 5 is probably a maximum. It depends on the question, it depends on your timing, and it depends on the examples that you use. Okay, comparisons is a different style of question, but the good news is you approach it in an incredibly similar way. If we have a little look at this past paper example, the question is compare and contrast. So straight away, that's quite easy to spot. Compare and contrast political ideologies of left and right wing politics in the UK. So again, you should be able to read a question like that and see that it's not asking you to make a connection between the left and right. It's asking you to compare and contrast. How are they similar? How are they different? And again, this extract is a little bit of a different extract type. Here we have a photograph of Nigel Farage, obviously known for being a right-wing politician and right-leaning political figure in the UK. This was around 2016, around the time of Brexit, and this poster was quite infamous in many ways. The breaking point poster, which symbolises Nigel Farage and the right's anti-immigration stance during this period. Again, the examiner is giving you a hint. Why not talk about immigration? Why not compare the right and left views on immigration? But as I've said, you'll need a little bit more knowledge to bring it in. So there's a lot of different ways you could take this. On the top left, I've outlined immigration because they've given me that in the extract. But look at all these other things that you could compare and contrast. How do the right and left differ on the NHS? How do they differ on Brexit? How do they differ on tax reform, electoral reform, freedom of speech? And also, perhaps a real contemporary, modern example. How do the left and right disagree on their views on Palestine and what is going on with the Israeli government? So, this is potentially how your essay could look, very similar to the connections one. No introduction, no conclusion. So you're maybe going to give some analysis of what right-wing views are about immigration and then compare them and contrast to left-wing immigration views. You could maybe do the same with the NHS. You could maybe do the same with tax systems, okay? And then finally, maybe a fourth section, how do the right-wing and left-wing differ on their views on Palestine? This is just an example of what one of these small sections could look like. And I always use the certainly however method here. Certainly, right-wing parties like the UK Independence Party or UKIP and the Conservative Party tend to adapt a stricter stance on immigration, calling for tighter controls on the number of people allowed into the country and a reduction in net migration. UKIP has long advocated for Brexit and for ending freedom of movement for EU citizens, arguing that has led to a strain on public services and has depressed wages. So what you've done there is clearly outlined the right-wing view on immigration. However, this is where you're bringing in your comparison, and it could be similar, it could be different. On the other hand, left-wing parties like Labour and the Scottish National Party tend to be more welcoming towards immigrants and refugees and often call for more generous asylum policies. For instance, or for example, Labour Party leader and now Prime Minister Keir Starmer has pledged to allow refugees to work and provide a path to citizenship for those who have lived in the UK for a certain period of time. So, that's what one of those mini sections look like. Another one, right-wing parties often take a more conservative stance on social issues such as abortion, LGBT rights, and drug policy. For example, UKIP has opposed same-sex marriage and has advocated for tougher drug laws, while the Conservative Party has opposed the legalization of cannabis. So there's some good own knowledge there and some good examples. On the other hand, this is the comparison, left-wing parties tend to support progressive social policies, including marriage equality, reproductive rights, and drug law reform. For example, the SNP has pledged to decriminalise drugs in Scotland and to support LGBT rights. So, as I've said, this can be nice and simple. A paragraph a paragraph of the one view and a paragraph of the other. Repeat this several times, and you will have a pretty strong answer if the examples and the knowledge is strong. Okay, to conclude then, what do we need to remember for section B? Vital. No introduction and no conclusion. Do not waste your time. You'll get no marks for it. It will just eat up valuable time in the exam. There's no need for it. Go straight into the connections or comparisons section. Also, no judgment. That will only be in section C. Two types of question, you're either comparing or connecting. Both of them you approach in very, very similar ways, but try and spot the difference between the question in the exam. Use the extract sparingly. So in other words, you must refer to it. It's difficult to put a number on it. It could be anywhere between maybe 2 and 5 times, depending. But again, sometimes it can be quite subtle. As I mentioned in the video, it can just be referring to the extract or using a bit of information from the extract. You're looking at somewhere between 2 to 4 sections, probably 5 maximum, I would say, because this is a 24-minute question. And then finally, the more precise and better your examples are, obviously the stronger your answer will be. When you're talking about political parties, if you can talk about particular politicians, particular laws, and so on, then it'll obviously be a stronger answer. Just to remind you, as always, you have a guide to the exam in your revision pack that has all of these diagrams and advice in. And also, I think this is a Bible for you for this exam. You've got a booklet filled with example answers. Not only does it show you how to structure them, but also it gives you a bit of a good idea